enabling web access. So far, we've talked about the different ways that you can connect your clients into your Citrix presentation server farm, but specifically there are two of them that we want to talk about that are configured via some form of web access. Remember, the three ways that we connect clients in are Program Neighborhood Agent, and Web Interface. In this area, Program Neighborhood Agent and Web Interface are all configured through the Access Suite console. And it's through here that we actually create the configuration that either the users get to when they go to a web page or their Program Neighborhood Agent gets to whenever it needs to refresh its configuration is through a web page. There's also this concept of a Conference Manager guest web access site. And this really isn't necessary for the CCA test, but you need to know what it is. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Conference Manager guest sites. For all of these, we're going to configure authentication for them, how the clients will actually log in and how they will authenticate to the website. We'll talk about workspace control, which is a concept of a client being able to disconnect from one location and reconnect into another location. We'll talk about client proxies, which is any sort of proxy configuration to get the client to the presentation server. And then we'll talk about the clients themselves and how we can push down new clients or even point the remote workstation to the Citrix server using a different type of client, perhaps a Java client or even an RDP type client. So before we get into the specifics of creating web access sites, I want to show you this picture here that I've created that shows a workstation, it shows a web server here, and then it shows 3 Citrix servers that make up a Citrix farm. What I want to talk about is the communication that occurs when a client attempts to connect to a Citrix farm using Web Interface. You'll see here that if I connect my client to the web server here like so, I'm actually opening up a TCP/80 or a TCP/443 HTTP or HTTPS connection to this web server. Then I receive a web page back from the web server that says, hey, this is welcome to the Citrix presentation server farm, please log in. I then log in with my credentials, and then the web server talks back to the Citrix servers using the Citrix XML service. This is the XML service that we've discussed before. This XML service, which can default to port 80 or sharing the same service with IIS, this XML web service is how the web server enumerates the application set that the Citrix farm has for that particular user. So after the logon occurs, the workstation connects to the web server, they log in, the web server connects via XML to the Citrix presentation server farm. The farm then returns a series of applications. These are the applications that you, the administrator, have configured for that user. So the application set gets returned back to the web server. The web page changes now. So the web page now shows the user what applications they have available, and then the user gets the opportunity to choose those applications. Once they choose those applications, which set of applications they want through this web server, then they connect into the Citrix farm. So let's stop and talk for a little bit about why we'd want to do this. You know, we can provide Citrix Program Neighborhood to our clients, and there's nothing wrong with providing Program Neighborhood to our clients, but if we provide Program Neighborhood to the clients, there's a lot of configuration control that the clients have to connect into the Citrix farm. We can still push applications to them, but they have a lot of options. They have to know, they have to go into the Program Neighborhood client, they have to click the right application. Most of our users, especially if they're not knowledgeable users, are more familiar with a web interface. They're used to going to Google. They're used to going to Yahoo to grab what they need. And so for them to go to a web server, to a website, log in with their username and password, and click the link that they want for the application they want, in a lot of cases, this is more convenient for the users. They're used to using that type of application. So in those instances, creating a web interface site is sometimes more friendly for our users. So the very first thing we need to do is open up the Access Suite console, and I've done that here for you now. When you first open up the Access Suite console, we see this Configure and Run Discovery dialog box that appears. What this allows us to do is to discover the resources that are available inside of our Citrix farm. Now, there's not going to be a lot there because this is the first time we've run it. If we click Next, we get the option of which products or components do we want to attempt to discover. We'll choose all of those and click Next. And then we need to contact a web interface configuration server. If you're in a small environment, this is probably one of your Citrix servers. Just pick one. If you're a larger environment, you may have a specific web interface configuration server that you will choose for creating the configuration for web interface and storing those configuration files. So we're going to connect to CTX Nugget 1 and click Next. We then have to specify at least one server running presentation server so that we can get information about the presentation server farm as well. In our case, we're going to choose CTX Nugget 1 also for this. And then Once discovery completes, we can begin configuring our farm for web interface. It's going to discover all the items available inside of our farm and now allow us to run the Access Suite console. In our Access Suite console, the node that we have particular interest in for creating web interface sites is here under Suite Components. You'll see Suite Components, Configuration Tools, Web Interface. In order to create a new web interface site, we need to right-click on Web Interface and actually choose to create a new site. This will allow us to create any of those three particular types of sites within this dialog box. I can choose to create a site for MetaFrame Presentation Server. This is a web interface site, Program Neighborhood Agent, or the Conference Manager Guest Attendee. In this case, let's choose MetaFrame Presentation Server. We can choose where we want the server to be located in. Do we use the default website in IIS? Do we have a particular path that we want to choose? This allows us to choose to create multiple web interface sites on a particular server. We can also set this as the default page for the IIS site. So if someone does http:// name, it will default to this location. In this case, since this is the only website that we're going to do for this particular server, let's go ahead and check this box. We now have an apply changes URL as well. This is the location where changes are, where the change application is done for that particular web interface site. We can specify the configuration source. We can choose to keep the configuration files local to that particular IIS server, or use a centralized configuration on one of our Citrix servers. If we type in or double-click the server name for where we want to store that centralized configuration, we can do so here and give it a port number as well. In this case, we'll choose CTX Nugget 1 so we can store that configuration information inside of our Citrix infrastructure. We click Next. We can give it a farm name. The farm name in this case is just farm1, and these are the servers that are in that farm name. In this case, I'm only interested in connecting to CTX Nugget 1. If I wanted to, I could also connect to CTX Nugget 2 as my secondary location for configuration. In this case, it would fail over to CTX Nugget 2 if CTX Nugget 1 was not available when the configuration was requested. Click Next. We now have the option to review the settings we showed and finish to create the new site. Now this is where things can get really cool. So we've created this web interface site. If we click here, we can actually see some information about the web interface site, the name and the configuration source and the technology associated with it. But if we've used Program Neighborhood before to allow our clients to connect into our servers, we've not had a lot of configuration control, or at least easy configuration control. Now that we have this web interface site created, we have a number of settings that we can set to configure how our client's user experience looks like whenever they get into the web interface. The first button of interest is this Manage Server Farms link right here. We already configured this in the previous screen, but this says, okay, for the farm one that we created, what is our connection port, what is our transport, and the SSL relay port? This is how we configure the web interface's connection to the Citrix Presentation Server farm. We can load balance this list, or we can choose, instead of load balancing, we can use a failover for this list. We can choose how long we may bypass any failed server for. If a server's down and we don't want to use that server, we can say, you know what, if that server is really down, then let's not try to go to it for at least an hour. We can choose what our XML service port is, if it's 80, that it's shared with IIS, or if we've chosen a different XML service port, and what transport type we want to use to connect to the XML service. Also, this concept of ticketing is used for IC authentication. We'll talk about that when we get into securing web traffic, but for right now, let's leave this alone. In our case, we're going to connect to CTX Nugget 1, and the only time that we'd ever connect to the other one is if CTX Nugget 1 happens to be down. So we click OK. Under Advanced, we have the option of selecting socket pooling and XML service communication. Socket pooling has to do with communication between the presentation server and the Citrix web interface server. When the web interface server needs to collect any data, it has to go back to the Citrix presentation server using the XML service to enumerate applications, to log in people, to pretty much grab any of its configuration because it's sitting on that presentation server. Every time that communication occurs, a TCP connection has to be established, the communication has to occur, and the TCP connection has to be broken down. Well, socket pooling, what this does is it enables a few TCP connections that stay there, that stay enabled, so that the process of building the TCP connection doesn't have to happen each time more information has to travel between the web interface server and the Citrix presentation server. For the most part, just leave this checkbox enabled unless you're seeing some problems. For XML service communication, this says, okay, well, how many minutes does it take before the socket actually times out, and how many times do you attempt to communicate before you say, okay, well, this service has failed? For the most part, you're going to leave these the same. You're going to leave these to the default settings. So let's get out of here and click OK and click on Configure Authentication Methods. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we can have our users authenticate into our web interface site. We can say explicit, which says, okay, they're going to need to punch in their username and password. We're going to say pass-through that says, well, whatever they use to log into their Windows box, well, they can use that to log into web interface. If they're smart cards, then we can use the same pass-through but with smart card. We can require a smart card for the login without pass-through, or we can just say, you know what, we don't care who you are, we're going to make you anonymous. In our case, we can choose explicit. And we can say, okay, do we have to require two-factor authentication? And in that case, do we choose RSA Secure ID? Do we choose Safe Word? If we have to require smart cards of some form, are we going to allow the users to change their password? Well, we can say, well, when it expires or at any time. This is particularly useful if you have users that are never connect into the domain that these Citrix servers are in, because if they never connect in, they need to be able to change their password sometime when their password expires. We'll just choose at any time. By choosing at any time, that enables a little button on the web interface screen that says click or change password. So let's go ahead and select those settings and click next. The next screen allows us to choose how we're going to authenticate into our web interface environment. We can choose either a Windows or NIS authentication type, or if we're a Novell shop, we can choose an NDS authentication type, and we enter our default tree name in here. We're a Windows Active Directory shop, so we're going to choose Windows here and click next. In the next box, we have the option of choosing how we want to present our domains to our users. Do we want to display the domain field or hide the domain field? And when I say domain field, we're talking about, when you log on to Windows, you see that username, password, and then in the domain. With web interface, we have the option of that third box, the domain box, of actually not presenting that to the users. So they just have to know they punch in a username and a password, and bam, they're in. If we want to display that domain field, we can choose if we want to allow the users to select which domain they're logging into, or if we want to enforce a particular domain. If we click the Add button, we're going to have to punch in our domain here. In our case, our domain is Nugget Lab. This is the NetBIOS name for our domain. Down here under UPN restriction, if we are a Windows Active Directory environment that uses UPN suffixes instead of just logging into the typical NetBIOS name of the domain, we can allow particular UPN suffixes as well. In most cases, if you're not using UPN suffixes, you can just click Allow any UPN suffixes and be fine. We'll click the Next button, and we get that screen again that allows us to review our settings, and then we're complete. Now, the really fun part is this customize appearance for user. This is where we actually get to choose how our web interface site is positioned inside of our web page. But before we actually go and configure this, let's actually go to that Citrix web interface site so we can see what it looks like. We're going to go to Internet Explorer. We're going to type in HTTP CTX Nugget 1. And CTX Nugget 1 will automatically redirect us to /citrix/metaframe/auth/logon.aspx. You'll see here that we have this logo, and we can change the logo. We can change the information up here in the right as well. We can even change the color. We can change these little red bars to something else that maybe fits our logo a little better. The gray bars, we can change the logon text if we want. You'll see here we have our username and password. If I type in my username and password, oops, I mistyped it. If I type in my username and password, you'll see my domain here is Nugget Lab. And log in, I'm going to get the applications that are available to me to the user administrator. Once login is complete, you'll see here the applications. Now, a lot of this is configurable inside of this location. If I minimize this now, you'll see here's that applications window. Here's the welcome and the message center information. If I click the overall layout button here, it'll allow me to choose how do I want the overall screen layout to look. Is it auto? Do I want it to fill the display? Do I want it to be compact, as small as possible? Do I allow the user to customize how they want the overall display to be? Under branding, we can choose how we want to brand our particular website. Do we want to change the logo information? Do we want to maybe not display a header at all? Do we want to maybe not display the footer information? Or maybe red's not our color, maybe green's the color of our company. So we want to change that red logo or that red coloring to green coloring. We can change the header image or the logo image to something that suits, something that is more appropriate for the users that are trying to connect to us. Maybe it's our company logo instead of the default Citrix logo. Do we want to make that logo a hyperlink? So if the users click on that logo, they get back to our company webpage. All of these are options inside of branding. We can change how we want the application window to be seen. Do we want the title bar to be in gray, or do we want to maybe change the title bar color to a different color, green? Green seems to be the color these days. Do we want to change maybe not 3 columns, but 2 columns for the application icons, and allow the users to customize how many rows of icons they get? Under the welcome area, do we want to change, again, graphics information about this welcome area? Do we want to change the message text? Is the default message text perhaps not something we're interested in? And instead we want to say, oh, I don't know, let's customize our welcome text and say, welcome to our web interface site. Well, exclamation point. It's very exciting. Click OK. So these are all the options that we have to be able to change how the web interface site looks for our particular users. Now, if we want to see what we've done, if we want to see our changes reflected in the web interface site, we can go back to our Internet Explorer window and we can refresh the page. And you'll see, whoa, looky there. Our configuration has changed. We've got this gray bar here. We've got, if we log in with administrator and we put in our password, you'll see we now have 2 instead of 3 columns for the icons. Oh, maybe not. You see here that we have 3 columns for icons instead of 2, and we configured 2 previously, and we still sort of have this gray bar here instead of the green that we were looking for. Now why do you think that's the case? I bring this up because it's important to talk whenever we're doing the customization for the user, how that the user's configuration can override our configuration. So you'll notice here that we have this add an image media gray grad.gif. This gradation here actually overwrites the green bar. So if we uncheck checkbox, we'll get this green bar. Now, we configured for 2 columns here, but we've also allowed the user to customize the number of columns. If you look back into the presentation server window and we choose to customize the user interface and look at presentation preferences, you'll see that the user has set 3 columns of applications as their default preference for number of applications. So the user preference is also defaulting to replace our custom preference. In order to prevent that from happening, we need to uncheck this box for allow user to customize. The moral of the story here is your mileage may vary. As you're configuring these, make sure you're aware of how your users are going to be able to perhaps override the settings. Maybe you won't get the desired look and feel that you're looking for. Now that I've selected those, if I go back and refresh the page again, you'll see that I have 2 columns of icons and a dark green bar here for applications, just like we want. So let's go back to our Access Suite console here, and we're going to talk about managing the client deployment. And this is really managing how our clients are brought down to the workstations at the other end of the network. We have 4 different ways that we can deploy clients to deploy Citrix clients to our clients. We have the local client, which is an separately installed client that's already existing on the remote workstation. We have the native embedded client, which is an ActiveX or a Netscape plugin that is automatically pushed down if the client doesn't have it. We have the client for Java, which is really kind of a client-list application, but it requires a JVM, a Java virtual machine at the client level, to deploy. And then we have the embedded remote desktop connection. And we call this embedded because this is the remote desktop connection that's already usually installed with Windows workstations as part of the Windows install. We can choose any one of these 4 that we want as our way to select for clients. We can also allow the user to select how they're going to connect into our Citrix server. Typically, as we're moving down, you get more options for configuring the client as you move further down this list. If I click Next, I have the option of how I want to choose my clients. If there is a newer version of the client, if there is a newer version of the client on my web interface server, do I want to automatically update that web client as they log on? If the user does not have a client, though, do I want to revert to the client for Java? And that's kind of cool, this client for Java, that what it is if a user doesn't have any client and they have a JVM of some sort sitting on their workstation, then we can use the client for Java so they don't actually have to have a client on the workstation. This is really handy if you have users that are out at a kiosk at an airport somewhere, or they're in a location where they may not necessarily be able to install a client. In that case, we would want to make available this client for Java because there's nothing to install at the clients. We can provide installation captions if we want, whether or not there's going to be some notices to the user whenever we're updating their clients. And we can also choose if we want to support either all versions or only version 8 or later of the clients. The reason for that is because version 8 and later have additional feature sets that the previous versions may not necessarily have, and I may want those feature sets to be available to my users that are connecting into my Citrix farm. So I click Next. If I'm using the web client, this is the information about that particular web client. In this case, it's version 9.0.32649.0. If we change this version, we're going to have to change this version information inside a web interface as well. This is the file name, this is the version information, and this is this class ID information, which is the unique identifier for that class. ActiveX object. These are similar to when you go to your Internet Explorer and you go to Tools and you go to Manage Add-ons. Each one of these add-ons inside of Internet Explorer has an ActiveX CLS ID. And it's this CLS ID that is the unique identifier for that ActiveX control. Going back to the ActiveX console again, I'm going to click Next. And for this client for Java, now this is the really cool part about the client for Java, we can choose what feature sets that we want to compile into that client for Java. And it's important to note that you should only enable those feature sets that you feel are necessary for deploying the client. If you don't necessarily need printer mapping, for example, if you're not doing printing or you maybe don't need encryption, you can pull those out of the client for Java to make that client for Java even smaller. Or if you want, you can say, okay, we'll just have some client bloat here and just give all of the options available for that client for Java. That's a decision that you're going to make depending on how your clients are connecting. If you want the people at the remote locations to have to use a root certificate to be able to connect in, you can use a private root certificate by checking this box and entering the certificate file name here. That allows you to secure which clients would be able to connect in using the client for Java. Additionally, if you want your users inside of web interface to be able to select what packages inside the client for Java they can choose, that's this checkbox right here. So I click Next, and I get the last option screen. Did I make the right decisions? And click Finish. Next up on our list is client-side proxies, and this is really important. Client-side proxies are not the proxy necessarily to get from the server to where it's trying to go, but to get from the client to the server. Let me go back to my picture here, and let me minimize this and bring up the picture. In this example, this is my client right here, and this is the web interface server. And if the client has to connect into the Citrix farm, if there is a proxy server between the client and the Citrix farm, that needs to be enabled inside of client proxies. If the client can directly connect, maybe they're on the same subnet, or maybe they're in a local LAN and there's no proxies there at all, then we really don't have to worry about the client proxy at all. Again, this is not the proxy for the servers to get to, say, the internet. It's the way for the client to get to the server. So go back to the ASC. Our default address mapping here says, okay, when that client attempts to connect to the server, I'm going to auto-detect the proxy information. That's back if I go to Internet Explorer and I go to Tools, Internet Options, and then I go to the Connections tab and the LAN Settings tab. This is the same as clicking this Automatically Detect Settings box here. If this is the way we have defaulted to our clients to find their proxy server, then that's going to work for us. If we have a specific proxy server that we put in for those clients, then we're going to need to choose not auto-detect, but client-defined proxy. Or if we have no proxy whatsoever, we're going to choose none. This is all going to be based on how the client needs to get to that server. In this case, all of our clients are on the same local area network, so there's really no proxy that we have to worry about to get from the client to the server, so we're going to choose none in this case. Our next configuration is managing client connection settings. And these should be pretty similar to you. These are going to be similar to the configuration settings you may have seen in Citrix connection configuration. We can enable bandwidth control on that particular client. We can also allow the users or deny the users to customize their color depth, their audio quality, and printer mapping. If we want to give them the capability to do that customization, we can do that here. Same thing with window size. We can say, you know, we're going to provide the default window size that we're giving you, but if you, the user, want to make that window bigger or smaller, you can do so here. For PDAs, we can enable connection to PDAs or customize how PDAs synchronize into that Citrix session. Do we want to allow keyboard shortcuts available, whether they're in full screen, whether they're on the local desktop? How do we want to handle those keyboard shortcuts? And lastly, down here you see kiosk mode. In kiosk mode, all of the user customizations are discarded, and we're only going to provide for them what we as the administrator think is the correct configuration. By disabling that, the user customizations are going to take place. They're going to take precedence over what we, the administrator, decide to do, as long as disable kiosk mode is enabled. Workspace control. With workspace control, we allow our users to leave particular locations and reconnect to their Citrix sessions from another location. If we enable workspace control, when the user leaves their first workstation and logs back into web interface in the second workstation, we can select that all of their sessions will be automatically reconnected. So when they log back into the Citrix web interface, then all of the Citrix sessions will automatically reappear for them. Or we can say just the disconnected sessions. We can also say after they log in, we can enable them to click a button button for them to reconnect to their disconnected or all sessions available to them. This is really important for users because if we have users that are moving around a lot, let's say they're doctors and they're moving from location to location, or they're instructors and they need to move from machine to machine throughout the day, this means that they don't have to reset up their workspace every time they log back in. We can also say if the user logs out of web interface, then log off all their sessions. And we can also allow them to customize it at various levels. I'm going to go back here to the Citrix connection configuration here on the MetaFrame toolbar. Anytime that you enable this workspace control, you need to make sure that Citrix connection configuration is set so that the disable timeout, the disconnection timeout is set to a high enough level so that the user can actually get to that other workstation in time. If I enable workspace control but set my disconnection timeout to like a minute, then that means the user has to run from their first location to their second location and reconnect in, or they're going to lose access to their workspace. So make sure that we set our disconnection timeout to a high enough value, maybe 60 minutes, so that the user can leave one workspace, go to another location, log back in, and still maintain that workspace control. So that's workspace control. Let me close out of here. So that's workspace control. So those are really all the settings for the test that you need to know in order to be able to answer the questions for the test. There are still a few other tasks down here that are not necessarily on the CCA but are important to know. Diagnostic logging enables or disables various components of Citrix that are used really only whenever you talk to Citrix technical support and they have you enable this diagnostic logging if something's broken or you're trying to figure out what's wrong. If you have multiple sites, you can actually load balance the configuration across multiple sites. You can create a site group, and any sites in this group point to a centralized configuration where they get all of the settings. So if we want to set the green taskbar on all of our web interface sites, and we may have multiple ones, we can do that here by creating load balance site groups. We have different places in this location we can create local site tasks. We can manage the configuration source, where this web server is looking for its configuration, either centralized or local. We can click here, we can manage IIS hosting, how we want to handle the IIS site. Is it the default website? Is it a different website on that server? Is it a different path for that IIS site? Also, do we want to repair the site? Has there been a problem? Do we want to just refresh the componentry on the site? Note that if you do repair the site, that's going to, any customizations that you may have done under the covers, that's going to be done here with repair site. Or we can uninstall the site completely if we just want to start all over from scratch. These next two options, import and export configuration, are useful if you need to move that configuration to another machine entirely, maybe out of this farm and into a completely different farm, or if you maybe want to back up the configuration. You'll see here there's import configuration and export configuration. If I choose export configuration, I have the option of exporting my configuration to a .conf file. This conf file is typically called webinterface.conf. Now, why would we want to do this? Obviously, having that configuration in a flat file means it's very easy to back up, but there's also some other really useful parts of it too. If we go to C inetpub www.root citrix metaframe/conf, that's the location where this file is going to be at. In this location, we find this webinterface.conf file. The interesting bit about this conf file is that there are actually a lot more configurations that you can do that may not be available to you natively inside of the Access Suite console GUI, but you can make them available inside of this webinterface.conf file. If you modify one of these settings and, for example, change allow customize log off from on to off, if you configure one of these, then you'll need to import in the new conference file or the new webinterface.conf file to make that change. Again, this is really handy if you've got perhaps an air gap between two different networks and you want to make sure that both web interface servers are configured exactly the same. Or again, if you want to be able to back it up so it's available if for some reason you want to do some disaster recovery for that webinterface.conf file. So this is available through import and export configuration. Lastly, we have the option of removing the site configuration completely. If we remove this site configuration, it's essentially taking the entire site back to zero and allows us to start back with completely nothing. And lastly, we can change this modify apply changes URL here. This is this update URL right here. If we want to change what that URL is, we can do so with this last link. So going back to our list of things that we want to talk about today, we've talked all this time about web interface and how to configure the web interface site. But there are two additional sites that we haven't talked about yet. And they're of less importance for the test, but we want to talk about them so you have an idea what they do. There's the Program Neighborhood Agent site, and there's also a Conference Manager Guest site. Let's talk about a Program Neighborhood Agent site real quick. Creating a new program neighborhood agent site is very similar to creating a web interface site. We click on the web interface tab and we say create site. But instead of creating a MetaFrame presentation server site this time, we create a program neighborhood agent services site. And the options that we have will change again. Instead of being the Citrix MetaFrame path, this is a Citrix PN agent path. Again, this is the location where our program neighborhood agent clients that are sitting on all of our little remote desktops, this is the location where they're going to get their configuration from. What's the apply changes URL? I can use the site IIS path for that or choose a different path if I want. If I click next, I can choose to use a local or a centralized configuration file. Again, as before, I'm going to go ahead and choose a centralized configuration file so that all of the configuration is stored local to my farm. If I click next, I can say what farm am I interested in looking at. Maybe there's multiple farms that I want to connect to for this particular program neighborhood agent site. In this case, there's just one farm and there's just this one server. If I click next again, I get the option for confirming the information. I click next again, and it's going to create this program neighborhood agent site. Remember, program neighborhood agent is what I use to configure how my desktop shortcuts are on my desktop, whether or not they show up in my startup menu. It's all the configurations that you see once we log on to program neighborhood agent. Now you'll see over here that we have a second site. This is our first site, Citrix MetaFrame, and now we have the second one, Citrix PN agent. If I click on the config XML file, I have the option of configuring some things for program neighborhood agent. Let's step through these options. Same as before with web interface, inside of program neighborhood agent, we have to configure how we want to authenticate to program neighborhood agent. As before, we have the same 5 options for types of authentication we can do. We can either require the user to re-log in with their username and password. We can say, okay, we're going to allow them to pass through or not have to use the same password. It'll just use the password that's used whenever the user logged onto the system. We can say pass through if they have a smart card enabled or just smart card authentication, or even anonymous so that they don't have to log in and there's no traceability whatsoever for the user getting into the web interface, into the program neighborhood agent site. In this case, let's choose props so we can force the user to have to re-log in. This is not maybe useful for you. You may want your users to have single sign-on, but this will allow us to see the box so we can see the box for logging in. The user could potentially even save the password if they want. If I click next, we can see, again, Windows or NIS or NDS. I'm going to choose Windows because we're an Active Directory environment. And I can say, okay, I'm going to allow the following domain, which is Nugget Lab. If I want my users to be able to choose their domain or any domain whatsoever, I can choose Allow Any Domain in the Domain field. Also down here with UPN restrictions, if I'm using UPN restrictions, I can choose which UPN suffixes are available to that client as well. All this is the same as it was for web interface. Under session options give me the option of deciding how large I want my window sizes to be. Do I want to allow for custom sizes for any applications that I'm connecting to? What sort of resources are available to my clients? Do I want to allow audio options? Do I want to allow Windows key combinations? Do I want to allow certain color bit depths? Do I want to enable workspace control for those users? All of those are configured here within session options. Managing application shortcuts. Application shortcuts tells me, okay, do I want to provide start menu shortcuts? Do I want to have shortcuts on the start menu? Do I want to use the web interface settings or do I want to use the settings that I configured inside of the CMC? Do I want to place applications always in the start menu? Do I want to allow the user to specify if they go in the start menu? Do I want them in the programs menu or do I want them in a special sub-menu? For desktop shortcuts, the same configuration, but do I want the applications to be placed directly on the desktop for my users? For notification area, I can say, do I want to display applications inside of the program neighborhood notification area? That's the little icon that appears down in the lower right of the screen in the system tray. And do I want to allow the user to override that setting? Once the shortcuts are there, they've got to get pulled out somehow. So if the user does not want to use program neighborhood, do I want the shortcuts to be pulled so that they're not confused that the shortcuts don't work? All of these are configured inside of Manage Application Shortcuts. For Manage Server Settings, this allows me to choose how I want to connect between the client and the server. Do I want the client to have to use SSL or TLS for communication? Do I want the user to be able to customize whatever URL they're connecting to? Or do I want to say, no, as the administrator, we're going to just give you the correct URL? Do we want to schedule an automatic refresh? So every 8 hours, the client's going to go back to the server and say, give me the new applications that are available, or give me the new configuration that's been created for us. Under configuration redirection, do we want to have redirection or do we want to have absolute redirection? All of these are configured inside of Managed Server Settings. So this configures Program Neighborhood Agent. So let's go to our Windows XP box. If we click over here to switch over to our Windows XP box, you'll see that we've connected actually into Program Neighborhood Agent. If we right-click it, we can choose to refresh the applications that are available to us. Here's the list of applications that we've configured over the course of all these nuggets. We can choose properties and say, okay, what do we want to change? Do we want to change the logon mode? Do we want to change the application display? These are the settings that we configured for the user as an administrator back in the Access Suite console. This is what the user has the ability to configure here. If we refresh the application suite, that will also refresh the configuration of Program Neighborhood Agent by going to the Program Neighborhood Agent website and choosing and viewing this config.xml file. This config.xml file is actually what configures Program Neighborhood Agent with all the settings that we've configured thus far. Lastly, we have the concept of a Conference Manager guest attendee website. We really haven't talked a lot about Conferencing Manager thus far because it's really not picked up in the CCA test. But the idea behind Conferencing Manager is if we go back to our little picture that we've been talking about before, and we have a conference that's going on inside of these Citrix servers, and they're all using Conferencing Manager to shadow each other so that they can all see the same screen. And you have a user that's sitting outside of your network. Perhaps there's a firewall here and the user's outside the network. And this user needs to be able to get into this conference. The guest attendee website allows this user on the other side of the firewall to connect into this internal conference. You only want to make this available if you have the proper networking safeguards in place. To create a Conference Manager guest attendee website, it's the same as creating any of the other websites. We choose Conferencing Manager guest attendee. We click Next. We choose the IIS site that we want. In this case now it's MCM guest as opposed to PN Agent or Metaframe. Use the site IIS path. We click Next. We can choose where we want to store our configuration. And just like before, we'll store our configuration on CTX Nugget 1. We can specify the server farm that we want. In this case, we actually have to put the host of the server, the host URL of the server that's hosting the external conference server. In this case, it would be ctx nugget1.nuggetlab.com. This needs to be a server that has this external conference server installed on it. And typically, this is a server that's sitting in a more protected location outside, perhaps in a DMZ or perhaps in a more protected area. This is the servers that are connected for that external conference service. If we click Next, we get the option of seeing what we've chosen, and when we complete to create the new website. Once the website's created, we get very similar configurations as the other two options, where we can go in and we can collect and manage server farms and customize the appearance for the user and manage the client deployment. All of these are very similar because this creates a website very similar to the web interface website that allows people to come in and see available conferences. Again, we're not going to talk a lot about this because Conference Manager isn't really hit on the CCA test, but just be aware that this is the location where Conference Manager websites are created. So, that was a lot of material to cover in a small amount of time. We talked about quite a bit. We talked about web interface. We created some Program Neighborhood Agent websites. We also talked about Conference Manager websites. And for each, we talked about authentication. We talked about workspace control. We talked about how to connect the client into the servers with client proxies, and also how to distribute the clients from the server to the client if we need to update clients or direct clients to perhaps a Java client or perhaps a different type of client. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.